That's fine. On behalf of the American Constitution Society, my name is Tino Cuellar from Stanford Law School, and I would like to welcome you to our panel on outsourcing government. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. I would like to thank the American Constitution Society, and I'd also like to thank my 4-year-old daughter, Ria, because she approves all my travel now. And she hesitated slightly as I was going out the door and said, "Why are you doing this again?" And I tried to explain outsourcing government, Blackwater. And a twinkle of understanding just gleamed in her eyes, so that's why I'm here. Whatever else is true about our views of justice and politics, and as you've seen from the panel that just finished, there's a good deal of diversity even within this organization, I think it's fair to say that all of us have hopes for our country and certain expectations of what our government should deliver so that we can make those hopes a reality. But the world in which these hopes are taking root is changing around us. You could say that Americans are facing extraordinary opportunities but also extraordinary challenges. We're facing those challenges with respect to national security, with respect to health care, with respect to migration, with respect to energy and the environment. And all of these challenges are playing out against the backdrop of a question. And it's a question about what exactly is the relationship between the public and the private. How exactly do we structure the relationship between corporations, private sector actors, individuals, and the government from which we expect so much? How do we define this relationship? What do we do about it? Where do we take it? I think sometimes you'll find that bold public rhetoric glosses over some of the complicated issues that are involved in trying to work out that question. Listen, for example, to this language, which I think will be familiar to all of you. Language from policymakers often calls for government agencies that steer more, roll less, inject competition into everything they do, and search for market, not administrative solutions. These principles seem geared to all but create a presumption in favor of outsourcing certain government functions, at least as long as the private sector promises, rightly or wrongly, to live up to certain public principles. These words are not taken from the current administration, but from the past one. This is basically the catechism of the Reinventing Government initiative of the Clinton-Gore administration. And to say that these words sound familiar by now is almost an understatement. They almost sound quaint. And if you look at the way the World Bank and the IMF approach their relationship with the rest of the world, it's a basic set of principles that is well on its way to spreading around the world. But it's not an uncontroversial principle. Just this past week, the Senate floor was awash in debate over the future of the Senate's restaurants. Some lawmakers insisted in privatizing the operation, complaining of, in the words of Senator Feinstein's, subpar food, a serious threat to the integrity of the legislative branch, if there ever was one. While others were doing their best to block this because of concerns, partly substantive, partly symbolic, about what it meant with respect to outsourcing, concerns about the scope of private power in the exercise of public authority even run through some strands of our constitutional doctrine, as when the notoriously conservative Supreme Court of the 1930s decried the National Industrial Recovery Act because it devolved too much power allegedly to the private sector in the Schechter Poultry case. And so we face dilemmas about the future of government and about the future, really, of the nation state itself. Nations are not just responsible to their workers, but to their citizens. So it's far from clear whether we should rule out reforms that can give citizens more and cost less simply because they require us to rely on the private sector more than we currently do. The federal government during World War II didn't nationalize every company building planes and tanks, nor is it obvious why NASA should make every space shuttle in-house, or why FEMA or the CIA should be precluded from hiring outside experts about Louisiana or Lithuania, both places, by the way, where the food is probably better than the Senate restaurants. On the other hand, what to make of private prisons with grim records of abuse and uncertain lines of legal accountability? Or private contractors whose cost-cutting measures leave workers with substandard wages? Or private security forces ferociously armed and fiercely shrouded in secrecy? Or sprawling conglomerates like the Carlyle Group who sell defense and logistics services to our government while buying up consulting firms that specialize in telling government what to buy? Time and again, from health to natural wealth, from prisons to power plants, from academic theories of transaction cost to those underscoring hard-fought achievements in bureaucratic capacity, the questions return. How should effective democratic government decide on what needs to be done by its own agencies and what can be safely outsourced to the market? Is there a natural baseline demarcating the services government should provide and not outsource? What legacy will today's outsourcing leave for the America of my daughter's generation? Should we or can we distinguish between government goals and the methods used to achievement? True to the depth of the importance of these questions, we have assembled a phenomenal panel. And it's even more phenomenal that they're here because ACS does not pay them millions of dollars to come, but they believe in what they're doing. And they will all speak for about 5 minutes initially. Before I introduce them, I'll just tell you a little bit about how we'll run. They're going to make opening statements about 5 to 7 minutes long. Then we're going to have a discussion. And then in the last half hour or so, we're going to open it up to your questions, which I'm looking forward to. To my right is Carrie Corpy, the Research Director of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. Thank you for being here. Next to her is Peter Wallison. He is the Burns Fellow in Financial Policy at the American Enterprise Institute and the former General Counsel of the Treasury Department, my old agency. Next to him is Laura Dickinson, Professor of Law at the University of Connecticut Law School and soon-to-be Foundation Professor of Law at Arizona State and Director of a new Center on International Law and National Security. Next to her is Scott Horton, a New York attorney known for his work in emerging markets and international law, especially in human rights, and an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School. And then we have with us Jay Johnson, an attorney at Paul Weiss and the former General Counsel of the U.S. Air Force. Carrie, take it away.
Thank you, Mariano. And thank you for inviting me. If there's one point I'd like to make in a conversation about outsourcing government is that I wish we'd change the subject. And seriously, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about outsourcing from the perspective of the folks who do the work. And in fact, I can't count the number of times in my career at AFSCME that me or my colleagues or our members have been asked to talk about privatization. On the other hand, and in striking contrast, the number of times when we're asked to talk about how to deliver top-notch government services is really very few. And it seems to me that there's something wrong with that picture, that what we ought to be talking about is how do we deliver the best government services. And if we did that, let's bear with me for a minute here. Let's look at the federal government. And we would see that when it comes to delivery of federal services, there are over 4 contractors for every civil servant in the federal government, 4 to 1. And yet when we talk about federal government reform, our scope is trained on that one civil servant, like that'll change things. We're looking at the 20% and not the 80%. Then when we look at state and local government, what's the picture there? Well, we really don't know. Nobody knows how many contractors work for state and local government, how much they're paid, what they deliver. Almost any state or local public official worth their salt can tell you, off the top of their head how many FTEs they have and how much payroll they pay to their employees. But you ask them about contracting and they get that deer in the headlights look on you. They don't count it. And yet, when you talk about reform at the state and local government level, it's usually about more outsourcing, doing more of what they can't count already. And what we'd see is that the frustration that people often feel with government, and nobody denies that there is frustration, is often with politicians and political appointees and the systems that they've put in place. And when politicians and political appointees feel the frustration, their first instinct is often to privatize. And what that does is replace the frontline workers, who are often as frustrated with those systems as the public is, replace government frontline workers with private sector frontline workers, who themselves are going to get pretty frustrated quickly. And it sets up one more middle person, between taxpayers and their government. And I think we've seen some of the consequences. When people feel frustration with government, they don't distinguish whether it's privatized government or public government. The Big Dig, the Walter Reed scandal, those are all frustrations with government that were in fact privatized services. So what we'd also see, and I think those things are a couple of examples, is once you do make that decision to privatize, it's a lot harder to manage the service. It's a lot harder to manage through a middleman than it is to direct your own workers. In fact, monitoring contracts and managing contracts can add as much as 15 to 20% to the cost of the contract, and that's a cost that's not often put in contracts because we'd like to do it on the cheap, but we see a lot of problems as a result. So what's the alternative if our goal really is top-notch public services? First, let's look at service delivery as a whole and decide what it should look like. Maybe we should have 80% of federal work done by contractors. Maybe we don't need to know how much state and local government work is done by contractors, but let's actually talk about that as adults and as citizens and make that decision. Second, I think we should acknowledge that some of the red tape that adds to the clunkiness of government was put in place for sound public policy reasons. One of the things that we hear, for example, is procurement in government. One of the reasons we have to privatize is because private sector firms can get things done so much more quickly than government has, and that's no doubt true. So if procurement rules are a problem, they were put in place, you know, so that allegedly taxpayers got the best bang for their buck, and I wasn't giving my son a contract when he wasn't qualified. But if we don't need those rules anymore, let's throw them away. You know, let's debate them, let's change them, but let's not just outsource work to companies that don't have to follow them and pretend they're not important. And the same is true of open meeting laws, FOIA laws, and so on. And finally, let's engage the workers on the front line, you know, the folks who you see after you've stood in line for an hour at the DMV, or the people who go into the homes of abused children. Let's engage them in talking about how services should be delivered. Treat them as an asset rather than a cost. And in situations where that's happened, they really have, our members have risen to the occasion. It doesn't happen very often because it's not easy. It's a lot easier to outsource a problem than it is to fix it. There's a kind of magical thinking about that, I think. And, you know, I think we suffer the results. And that mentality has led to a 50% increase in the outsourcing of federal services from 2002 to 2005 in 3 years, an increase that outpaced our ability to manage it or even consider the consequences, I would say. And that mentality has led to state and local government contracting when they can't even count what they've already got outsourced or who it's to or what they're getting. We assign to government, I think, some of the most important and difficult jobs in our society. And for all its flaws, it exists for the public good. And so I think when we're talking about outsourcing, we ought to bear that in mind. And I'd go back to my first point, which is let's change the conversation. Let's instead talk about top-notch public services.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thanks very much. I agree. Of course, the issue is how do we deliver top-notch public services? That's why I think that as many government services as possible ought to be privatized. Now, there are, of course, services that can't be privatized effectively. I think those are the ones where they can't be effectively priced. There are issues of national policy or where cost is a secondary consideration. And I'd mention, of course, national security issues, personal security, law enforcement, relations with foreign governments, control of ports and entry, regulation in cases where markets don't work, such as drug and food safety, and the allocation of the electromagnetic spectrum. You can go on and on about issues of this kind. These are where the government really has to step in because there is either a market failure or you are talking about something where price is really not a consideration. Public safety comes before all of those things. But beyond that, there is a category of services that can be priced and can be done more efficiently. And sometimes we forget that there are a group of people out there called taxpayers who receive these services and ought to receive them at the most efficient, in the most efficient way and at the least possible cost. As consumers, we expect them to get those services from the private sector in stores and in every other way they interact with people who provide services, and they ought to receive the same kind of efficient services from the government. Now, private sector services generally tend to be more efficient. This is not a myth. This is the result of one factor, and that is competition. Competition does cause services to be priced competitively. When private contractors are offering their services to the government, there is a competition for providing the services at a particular cost. The contract is signed, the services are provided at that cost. Sometimes the services are not good. But if the services are not good and the government is not policing the contract, that's not a problem that goes to the private contractor. That is a problem of the government not performing well. And that happens all too often, because once the contract is signed, the government frequently just washes its hands and doesn't have the staff or the interest in following up. And that's because the government is not as responsive to the needs of the private individual who is the customer, that is the American taxpayer, and the American who is receiving, the American citizen or other person who is receiving services from the government. If a private organization, like a contractor, were dealing directly with consumers, and consumers were unhappy with its services, that is, if the consumers were actually paying it, it would soon be out of business. But unfortunately, in many of these cases, private contractors are delivering their services to the government. The government doesn't care very much in the normal case about how much these services are costing or whether they're being performed well, because the complaints that come into the government are not responded to. So you can see the difference between what happens when a government service when a government service deals directly with the public, but is supported by government funds, or when a private sector organization deals directly with the public. In the latter case, the services are usually delivered much more effectively and at a much lower price, because that company tends to be competing with others, not only on price, but on quality of service. So private sector contractors tend to be more efficient, at least in theory, more efficient, and if properly overseen by the government, they would perform more efficiently, but the government doesn't oversee them perfectly well. The people who work for private contractors also tend to be better skilled, because if the private contractor is functioning as in relation to private consumers, its employees have to be skilled, otherwise it will go out of business. If they're functioning only in relation to the government, sometimes they can get away with subpar performance, because the government, as I say, is not as concerned about the quality of services, because those services frequently are going to people who the government isn't paying very much attention to. Private sector contractors also have better technology, as a general rule. If you've been reading the papers, you know that the IRS had to scrap completely its entire computer system. The same thing has happened at the FBI. I mean, they're always way, way behind in technology than the private sector. And finally, and this is very important, private sector services can be terminated at relatively little political cost. Ronald Reagan once said, "The closest thing we'll ever come to immortality is a government agency." And that's the way it usually is. Once the agency is set up, it never gets terminated. What happens is it's allowed to change its functions. I don't have time, I'm sorry. I don't have time to go through some of the examples of government agencies or government services that could be privatized, but I'll just mention a few and then I'll end. And we could say education and training, designing, building, and maintaining infrastructure, postal and express services, think of FedEx versus the post office, managing parks, museums, ports and public lands, health care and research, and tax and toll collection. These are a few of the things that could be done. You could run through the various services that government performs and find many others. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Dickinson.
Thank you so much. I'm going to focus on the increasing use of military and security contractors by the U.S. government overseas. And we're now at a point where we see more contractors on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan than there are troops. That is a huge expansion of the use of contractors, at least compared to recent history, and a real shift in the way we project our power overseas. The contractors are doing a whole range of things. They're cleaning latrines, serving food, maintaining weapons. They're also providing security to diplomats and bases, and they're conducting interrogations. And as we all saw with the Blackwater incident last September, the implication of contractors in the abuses at Abu Ghraib prison, that there are real risks here to what I would call public law values, values including human rights, principles of limits on the use of force, as well as transparency and accountability. And in fact, I've been interviewing a number of uniformed military lawyers over the past several months, and a couple who've been in Baghdad recently said that there are as many as 2 incidents a week in which there's some allegation of contractor abuse. Now, in response, many have argued that we shouldn't outsource at all. There's a debate right now going on in Congress about whether certain functions like interrogation are inherently governmental and shouldn't be outsourced. I think this is a very important debate that's worth having. But I also think that for the near term and the medium term, outsourcing, including for security and other functions, is here to stay. And that in addition to the debate about whether to outsource, we also need to have a robust debate about how we can build in better accountability and better respect for these public values in a world in which we do have this kind of outsourcing. And I'm going to focus very briefly on 3 areas: criminal law, contract, and organizational culture. Now, first, with respect to criminal law, the assumption is that there are just so many loopholes in the laws that apply to contractors that it's a law-free zone there, and there's just no law that's applicable. Turns out that's not actually true. There are numerous legal frameworks: international law, military law. The Uniform Code of Military Justice just got amended to apply to contractors. Numerous federal criminal statutes, including the War Crimes Act, Special Maritime and Territorial Jurisdiction, and the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. Now, there are some gaps in these laws. For example, the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, MIJA, gives federal courts jurisdiction over crimes committed by contractors overseas if their employment relates to supporting a Department of Defense mission. So there's some question about what happens if the contractor is employed by another agency like the State Department. In the Blackwater incident, the State Department is saying that the contractors aren't covered. I think you can make an argument to the contrary. Congress is working to amend this law. But the point here is that the real issue is not the law on the books, but rather the law in action. And the question is, how can we better design our institutions of enforcement to make them work better? I would argue that we need a central office within the Department of Justice that's responsible for these prosecutions, with reporting requirements to Congress so that there can be better public oversight and transparency. Similarly, the agencies doing the contracting need to do a better job reporting to Congress. They're still working on counting all of the contractors. They also should be doing substantive reporting on cases in which there is a misconduct. And again, not to condemn a particular contractor, but rather so that we can keep account of what's going on. If we can do a human rights report on all the countries in the world, we should be able to do some reporting on incidents involving our own contractors. We also need to have investigators on the ground, Department of Justice investigators on the ground. In the Blackwater case, it took 2 weeks before they got there. Turning very quickly to contract, every one of these privatization agreements is founded in a contractual agreement. Congress and the agencies should mandate that the contracts include more terms that specifically protect these public values like human rights. And, we can draw some lessons from the domestic setting here, but the contract should be much more specific about, for example, that the contractors have to get certain kinds of training. In the Blackwater incident, the State Department's own report noted that the Blackwater employees didn't have sufficient training in the limits on the use of force, and specifically the use of deadly force. We've got to standardize these terms. DOD and state have different requirements here. So with respect to the use of force, security contractors employed by the Defense Department were required at the time of the incident to they were required to fire aimed shots in the direction of the threat, whereas the State Department contractors were not required to fire aimed shots. And then just two very quickly final points. We need to look at the use of accreditation. That's something that's been very successful in the healthcare context, where independent organizations have rated and monitored HMOs getting public funding. We should explore this in this area. And then finally, just very briefly, organizational culture. We shouldn't underestimate the ability of organizations internally to impose controls. The military post-Vietnam has enhanced the role of military lawyers to provide training in the rule of law for troops. The military lawyers are in the field advising commanders on targeting decisions. The contractors, the security contractors, are completely outside that. They don't get the training ex ante. They're not getting the advice in the field. And we need to think about whether we need to give more authority to the JAG Corps over contractors, or look at ways that the contract firms themselves can develop better mechanisms of accountability, such as ombudspersons and so forth. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Horton.
Thank you. Well, I guess maybe in a better structured panel, I would now be engaging Laura and disagreeing with her on several points. But I can't do that, in fact, because I think she's presented a lucid, clear analysis of the problem and some also an obvious list of issues that need to be examined by the next administration. In fact, this debate's a rather odd one because there's almost nothing that comes on the other side of it when the criticisms are raised. We're dealing with one of the areas of particular concern in contractors involving national security. We should know at the outset that there have always been military contractors. They were there at the time of the American Revolution. They've been there ever since. So it's ridiculous to approach the debate suggesting that there shouldn't be contractors. But we have a fairly radical transformation of the force configuration today, one in which contractors have mushroomed way beyond the historical role they've played into new roles. In fact, it's hard to identify the roles that they're not playing now. They're playing almost operating in almost every arena that the uniformed military has operated. And I think that comes as something of a surprise. It comes as a surprise particularly because the country did not go through the sort of policy review and deliberation that would have been appropriate to a buy-in for this sort of radical change. It went on below the surface. And now I think we're approaching a new administration where it's going to be imperative that there be this national dialogue and review. But I've also addressed in more detail the question of accountability. And I think that's probably that should go close to the top of the new administration's agenda. Now, I'm not going to cover all the accountability issues. I'm just going to give you a pitch for this. There's a report I worked on. Kevin Lanigan, who's here at the end of the second row, worked with me on it. In fact, he's really the detail man if you've got really sharp questions. Kevin's the guy you want to talk to. And we've got about 100 copies of them out in the front, so grab one. And if they're all gone, see Kevin, because I'm sure he'll get you a new copy. I can't cover everything that's dealt with here, but I guess I'll give you just a couple of highlights about it. One is the footprint of the force. There is this radical change. Laura noted it. I mean, we have more contractors in Iraq than we have uniformed service personnel. That is amazing. It presents a totally different concept of what our military is. And part of our national identity has been this idea of a citizen soldier from the time of George Washington going forward. All right, maybe a lot of you think that this is romantic nonsense, and you can't have it in the modern war. We have professional military, et cetera, et cetera. But, this transformation requires a national dialogue and national discussion. It needed to happen in Congress, needed to involve the public. That really didn't happen. That's got to be revisited now. And come secondly to the accountability question, and as Laura noted, we have a regime in place that's dealt with our uniformed military service personnel. It's an old regime. I happen to think it works really well. It works quite well. Nothing to do with what's going on in Guantanamo with the military commissions, by the way. I think almost all the problems we have there come from departures from our military law regime. But that regime works just fine, and it's working fine in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's say there aren't some criticisms that can be leveled. But we don't have the parallel structures in place for dealing with this vast new community of civilian contractors. And when we talk to the administration, it's like some big black hole opened up and swallowed it. There is no law. In fact, it's sort of funny how that happens over and over again with this administration, the black hole that swallowed the law. And I found, we find when we examine this and discuss it in our report, it's just not true. I mean, there is a legal architecture that provides a basis for law enforcement here, a very clear one. The principal actor certainly should be or should have been the Department of Justice. And the key problem we've got here is the Department of Justice has simply been AWOL. They haven't been there. They haven't been investigating cases. They haven't been prosecuting cases. Their record in Iraq in particular is just disgraceful. Congress has tried to highlight it. There have been a whole series of hearings held. I participated in I think, all those hearings. And, it was somewhat partisan at the beginning. Well, actually, by close to the close of last year, it became a completely bipartisan consensus between Democrats and Republicans that there was a serious problem and that the focus of the problem wasn't the Justice Department simply not doing what it was supposed to do. Now, I think right now there's going to be a focus in three arenas. One's the Department of Justice, which has got to live up to its responsibilities. Second is the Defense Department, which I think is struggling now to play a constructive role here. And Secretary Gates has issued regulations for court-martials, carrying forward an enforcement agenda, which I think is very important. But third and most important really is the legislative agenda. And I think it's not that Congress has, failed to act and provide legislation. That's been done. But there's an education function that has been started and needs to be carried forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horton. Mr. Johnson.
Hello. I'm Jay Johnson. One of the things that impresses me most about serving on these ACS panels is I often find myself on a panel with people who've literally written the book on the subject, and so I have to be careful not to put myself forward too much as an expert. But I want to talk a little bit about the practical experiences and problems that confronted the Department of the Air Force in 1998 to 2000 when I was General Counsel of the Air Force, serving as the lawyer for a government agency of 380,000 people and an $80 billion budget and a military service. And I have to emphasize that my time at the Pentagon was pre-9/11. It's a different world now. But as was mentioned, the effort to privatize a lot of government functions, specifically in the defense area, began really in the Clinton years. And so my focus in my remarks will be on national defense. When I got to the Pentagon in October 1998, we were engaged in a general effort to privatize a number of functions. Most prominently, military housing and logistics support, Air Force Materiel Command, fixing the planes, fixing the missiles, and so forth. We were in a general effort to privatize those functions. And when I got to the job of General Counsel of the Air Force, I found that the Air Force had got itself into a real mess with regard to one of its privatization efforts. Air Combat Command, Air Force Base Ellsworth, South Dakota. ACC had they had to strip the land. They wanted more housing. This is the kind of problems you face when you try to privatize. They had an area of a base, wanted new military housing. So what the Air Force had done was to lease the space to a builder in Texas. The builder then built the homes and owned the homes, and the Air Force then leased the homes from the builder. So Air Force owned the land, the builder owned the houses, and the Air Force was leasing the homes for the benefit of its members there. And they had got themselves into a problem because the Air Force took the position that the homes were dilapidated, and they refused to put any of the enlisteds in the homes. and said to the builder, it's going to cost you X millions of dollars to fix this. And the builder said, no, I don't think it should cost that much, and I don't see anything wrong with this housing. And the lease that the Air Force had entered into with the builder basically said, you have to continue paying rent no matter what. So we got empty housing that's dilapidated, owned by the builder, for which we're paying rent. And the general counsel's office, when I got there, was insisting that we had to continue to pay the rent. The JAGs were insisting that we stop paying the rent. And I made the decision, you know what, let's just stop paying the rent. And we stopped paying the rent, and the builder finally said, okay, you got me. And they fixed the homes. One of the points I want to make here is, at least when I was in the Clinton administration doing this, the effort to privatize whatever you do, whatever agency, particularly in the defense area, Congress has an intense interest. Congress will muck around and try to change whatever you want to do because Congress has constituents. They have constituents that are contractors, that are builders. And Congress is concerned about BRAC. They're concerned that if you privatize too many functions at their particular base in their district, you make the base eligible for a BRAC round. And so Congress, while I was there, and this is probably still true, was always imposing through special legislation or various different things ways to micromanage the privatization efforts. We had a 50-50 requirement for logistics, for Air Force Materiel Command. No more than 50% of a certain segment could be privatized. And so Congress micromanaged whatever we did. And the lesson I took from all of this is you can make bad deals, whether you privatize or don't privatize, that are hugely wasteful for the government. And with every defense authorization bill or appropriation bill, somebody on my staff would have to comb through to look for some midnight special that got inserted into the law directing that some particular Air Force function be given to a specific military contractor. That was true every single year. And fortunately, I was not involved in the mess to lease tankers from Boeing that was happening just as I was going out the door. So my successor had to deal with it. But the 2 points I want to make here, the 2 thoughts I have are these. One.
Sorry about that. Things in this space can be a disaster sometimes.
One, make it real quick. One is that the military is a unique culture. He handed me a note that said time. That's what that was about. The military truly is a unique culture, very different from the private civilian world for reasons that I can get into later. Second, one of the things we have to deal with, which the Judge Advocate General and I tried to deal with before I was leaving, was what to do about private contractors in forward deployed areas. The UCMJ in certain circumstances does extend to them, but the thing that nobody really wants to talk about, which needs to be talked about, is does a private military contractor in a forward deployed area, should that person be considered an enemy combatant? The military, I am certain, zealously guards the status enemy combatant. So if someone engaged in offensive operations is captured, what is that person considered? An unlawful enemy combatant? The ironies of that, obviously, I don't need to get into here. So thank you. Sorry I took so long.
No, it's okay. And in fact, I should apologize because if you're a moderator and people have really interesting things to say, like now you're totally torn, and you can see that's why the chair's falling off. I'm trying to find excuses not to go over and say time because I want to continue hearing them, but I also want to hear you guys. So let me just kick off the discussion and say this is very helpful, but I want to put Laura and Carrie on the spot a little bit and say that if there's a common theme that runs through almost everything that's been said on this panel so far, it's this, as I see it. Contracting is potentially problematic. It can raise difficult questions of accountability, and sometimes bad things happen. We have failed. And here are some things that can be done, either in terms of, as Peter was saying, thinking through what it is that we should put into the contracting box or how we should structure it. But I want to see if you don't want to go a little further and not be more explicit about things that you really think should be off the table. And I don't mean, of course, privatizing the legislature, although, you know, depending on what member you're talking about, that may have already happened. But if you drill down just a little bit and you ask yourself, can you think of a decision that's either been made by a state and local government or by the military where you say, here the problem isn't that we wrote the contract wrong, that we didn't have metrics of accountability. The problem is this should never have been privatized to begin with.
Okay, well, look, I think this is a debate worth having, and certainly any time in the foreign affairs area, a contractor has the authority to use force. That raises very special concerns. So that would put security contractors and interrogation up for really serious, robust discussion about whether it makes sense to privatize them. On the other hand, you know, particularly as we try to draw down troops in Iraq, I just think the reality is that there are going to be contractors on the battlefield. And so at the same time that we have this debate about what's inherently governmental, we have to have more robust accountability mechanisms for the contractors that are there. And I should note that the inherently governmental label is itself totally ineffective. It's a paper standard that is effectively non-justiciable. So we've got to think about just categorizing something as inherently governmental doesn't work. We have to think about enforcement mechanisms and accountability. So you're always going to go back to enforcement and accountability. The other thing I would say is I think it's helpful to think about core versus inherently governmental functions. It might create a new framework or a new category for thinking about these things. And if there are certain functions that we don't want to lose in-house control or oversight from, we might want to think about making them core and mandating that a certain percentage can't be outsourced and there has to be a certain amount of supervisory authority.
I might draw the line in a different place than other people, but and I think I do agree with Laura that in a lot of the places the problem is with how the contract is written, and I think in some services it's hard to write a contract that protects the public interest, where, for example, public benefits are distributed. Contracts are often written so that contractors make more profit the more benefits they deny people. And we've seen that in, and I'm not sure how you write a contract to get around that. When we talk about incarceration, it's almost impossible to write a contract, as far as we can tell, because folks have tried a lot, to write a contract that doesn't, that prevents abuse and that doesn't make it, put some incentive in to cut corners that are not in the public interest, that jeopardize safety, that jeopardize security. And those are a couple of areas where nobody's quite figured out how to write the right contract, I think.
I'm going to want to follow up with Peter on one of these points, but Scott, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce a little bit of what Laura said. I think we should look at the unfinished chapter from Abu Ghraib. The unfinished chapter is the role that contractors played there, and the Department of Defense investigations, they come to a very, very sharp focus on the role that, you know, two contracting companies played, and they link a number of their staffers to the most serious abuse that occurred in Abu Ghraib. This was investigated to a fairly well, recommendations of prosecution, portfolio passed to the Department of Justice. What happened? Nothing has happened. Absolutely nothing has happened. And when we go back and look at those contracts when we come out, we see the contracts themselves are just disingenuous. They don't reflect what these people were doing. And I think this reflects, you know, one of these sharp line areas, which is why would you possibly involve a contractor in, you know, direct interrogation of detainees in a prison? And I would suggest the answer is evasion of oversight.
It's a fair point and persuasive one in many ways, but just to press you for a second on that. So if the counterfactual is none of the interrogation activity ever ends up in the hands of the private sector, is it your contention then that we'd see some boost in the level of quality with respect to meeting standards and achieving public goals? Like, would a lot of this not have happened if that had been different?
I think in the area of discipline and control and accountability, you would see some, because our accountability mechanisms ran with the military, they ran with the Uniform Code of Military Justice and military training, and that did not extend into the private sector.
Okay, we'll come back to this.
I think I have to disagree. Abuses like Abu Ghraib occur and have occurred at the hands of the U.S. military. Abuses worse, frankly, than Abu Ghraib. When you are an occupying force, it is inherently demoralizing to be an occupying force without clear guidance, clear goals, and a clear exit strategy. And so abuses occur. And I agree that there would have been more accountability, but I think they happen in this kind of situation, whether by a private employee or a military member.
I want us to continue this line of discussion in a second, but I wanted to bring Peter in, and let me just frame the question a little bit differently, Peter, to pick up some of what Kerry was mentioning. So you made the point that when there is a problem with a contractor, whether it be in the context of national security or otherwise, that can't necessarily be disentangled from government, both in the sense that government is responsible for providing oversight and in the sense that there are politics about this one way or the other. But I guess my question for you would be, how does one guard against the following scenario, which is one that I found confronted me when I worked in government, where some discussion about the possibility of contracting out leads to some meetings with potential bidders on the contract, and then they say, well, of course we could do this better than government. You, of course, will have to tweak a little bit what you're asking us to do, and it will go into how the contract is written and what you expect from us, and before you know it, it's not entirely clear what it was that you were trying to achieve to begin with before the more technocratic discussion began about how to frame it in a way that will make the contracting work.
You know, I'm quite puzzled by this because the entire private sector runs on contracts. And no one has ever found it impossible to write a contract that will produce good services from someone you are contracting with. The whole difference, and this happens all the time, it's done by every business, outsources or contracts for a good portion of the services or even the products it provides. There are even some businesses that don't have any manufacturing at all and do it entirely by contracting, and you wouldn't imagine that when you buy a product like something made by an Apple, for example, that they're having these things outsourced to other manufacturers, and they control the quality of the product, just the same way they control the quality of the services that are provided by contract. The difference is, as I said in my opening remarks, difference is that they are actually very sensitive to how well their contractors perform. That is not true of the government. I'm afraid that is just a fact of life. The government is large. Its employees are not particularly interested in serving the public. They don't have the incentive to serve the public. Private organizations can perform good service. They can also perform bad service. But in the private sector, they generally perform very good service, seamless service with the people they are contracting with. So it is possible to write a contract. It's possible to enforce a contract. It just isn't done by the government.
But, and I want to get others a chance to jump in, but just to clarify then, it sounds like implicit in what you're saying is the idea that at the very minimum, the way this game should be played is that the private contractor to be should say, you know what, the way the contract is written, it's just not profitable for us to do, and we're just going to walk away.
Well, that's one possibility. I don't know exactly what the hypothetical is behind that question, but yes, if a private contractor can't continue to perform the contract under the terms that the government has laid out, yes, the contractor can walk away, and the government has a right against that private contractor, which it can then pursue. And that happens in the private sector all the time. If you've signed a contract that you can't perform, and in fact you don't perform, the party you've signed the contract with has a right over against you, and you suffer. You may have to pay some damages. But I don't quite understand what the problem is here. It is possible for the government to do these things. The fact that the government doesn't do it is a very complicated issue. It has to do with the kinds of rules that are put on the government for contracting. It has to do with the interference by Congress, for example, at the federal level, and how the agencies do things. That's been mentioned on this panel. But it is not an acceptable reason to say, I think, that contracts can't be written and enforced to perform government services as well as it is possible to do them. And I think that once the contract is written, and if it is enforced, those services will be produced more efficiently and at lower cost for the benefit of the taxpayers.
Carrie and then Laura.
Yeah, this is a really serious subject, and it's hard to have a serious debate about it when you hear a statement like government employees are not interested in good service. That is simply, I mean, I have a lousy plumber, but I don't believe that private sector employees aren't interested in good service. I get frustrated when I go to Bank of America, but I do believe that private sector employees as a whole, I don't generalize from those experiences. And I invite you to meet some of our members who, you know, I really do. I really do. I just
Wait a
don't
minute.
think it's...
We are talking generally here, and that is, I was not, of course, speaking about every government employee, and I hope you all understand that. But the reason that government contracting isn't working is that, in general, government is not interested in this. And I'm not speaking about individual employees. I've met people in the government service who are, in fact, many of them worked for me at one point, who were exceedingly diligent. And people I would have loved to have worked with for my entire career because they were so loyal and diligent for what they were intended to do. There are wonderful people in government. I'm talking about one simple fact, and that is the pressures that are brought on government agencies to perform effectively, to give good service to the public, are less effective than the pressures that are brought on private sector organizations to provide the same services by consumers.
Laura,
And as a result of that, we're always going to see a difference here. But that doesn't mean that, I'll say it one more time, I'm sorry, that doesn't mean that that when contracts are written and private sector organizations are performing those contracts, they wouldn't still be able to perform them more efficiently than government itself.
Okay, so I have 2 points. First relates to the earlier question, and I just wanted to respond about the abuses at Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. General Fay concluded that the commingling of contractors and troops and other governmental agencies was a zero for contractors. And in the conflict thus far, there have been 70-odd prosecutions of troops for misconduct. No, it's not a perfect system, but for contractors, there's been really only 1 or 2. So and then a second point has to do with the problem that when you outsource foreign affairs functions, you don't have a really good constituency for producing political oversight and control. And in fact, part of the reason to outsource, Clinton did it in Kosovo, is to reduce the political costs of the war. So this is a fundamental problem in trying to produce oversight and accountability.
Okay, we've got more interest on the panel to say a few things at this point, but I want to open it up to your questions, and we'll get to whatever needs to be said that way. Let me start with you, sir, right here.
Mr. Ellison, you've made some interesting points. I also hear somewhat of an ideological bent to what you're saying.
Really?
And my question for you is, how about coming up with some ideas about how we can fix the procurement oversight process? As I'm sure you're aware, the number of employees designated by the federal government to oversee the procurement process has diminished dramatically in the last 15 or 20 years. And why not incentivize better procurement oversight? I mean, you seem to jump to the idea that, well, you know, the government's not doing such a good job with this, let's outsource it. Why not fix something that is perhaps broken without jumping to the outsourcing solution?
Well, first, the outsourcing solution, in my mind, is a question of efficiency and cost. I made a distinction at the beginning between those things that, and I think you used a useful phrase, and that is core government functions and others. I think that where cost considerations are not particularly important, then the government ought to be performing those services, unless they can be performed better in terms of because of skills of a certain kind by private organizations. But where costs become much more important, where the service can be performed equally well at the private level, then the government should outsource those services. I think what your question was is why shouldn't the government have more people policing these contracts, more people working on the procurement of these contracts and then policing them? Absolutely true. But that, and I agree with that, but what you have to add to that is those people, as you're suggesting, have to have some incentive to perform well and make sure that the contractor is performing well from the standpoint of the people who are ultimately receiving the service, that is, the American taxpayer, the citizen, the resident, and so forth. That's a really hard thing to do because there isn't a mechanism like a price-quality relationship that exists between the government and the ultimate consumer, so that the government has a very difficult time finding out whether the consumers are being well served. And I guess my sense of it, if we were really to design something that would work well, it would involve a constant testing of how the services are being performed through polling or otherwise, some other mechanism. That would have to be reported to the government, and then someone with some common sense would oversee all of that in the agencies that are performing it, maybe an ombudsman or someone of that kind, who would then report to the top of the agency and say, this service is not being done well. We have to change the contractor, or we have to do something more to make that contract perform better. That's the only thing I can see right now, but I haven't given much thought to it. If people really were worried about it in government, there are plenty of resources to come up with ideas for this, and Congress is not going to oppose it.
If I could just add one point about this, you're getting to one of the issues I was trying to put on the table in terms of not so much the difficulty of writing a contract, but the need to ensure that however the contract ends up being written, there's some coherence between what's in the contract as a responsibility for that private sector actor and what it is that the statute or the regulation actually requires. So in addition to having a clear accountability issue before us in terms of making sure the contract benchmarks are met, we have the separate one involving the fit between the statute and the law and the contract. Mm-hmm. Question from over here. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious about, you guys have touched a lot on the foreign industrial military complex. We've touched very briefly on HMOs, briefly on prisons. I'm curious about education. And I know that as a group, we tend to be very resistant to outsourcing education. And I don't want to push on federal versus state level. But in terms of identifying an area where certain entities have been privatized, are doing much better by many factors and many metrics than their public counterparts, why is it that there is such resistance to the privatization of education? How could we perhaps approach the issue of education with outsourcing to allay some of the concerns that liberals have about privatizing education, where at the same time being able to reap the benefits that outsourcing can provide? Or is this simply a core function that for reasons beyond economics, et cetera, just we cannot privatize, and why, if so?
Carrie, you want to?
Well, I would be interested in talking about the premise that privatized education has done better, because I think a lot of the studies of charter schools show that there's not a lot of difference. But one of the things that we've been concerned about is that you're talking about apples and apples, that if there are standards that apply to public schools, those standards apply to the charter schools as well. And that there's open access to records and so on, just as there is with the public schools. And that's, I think, been one of the things that we've advocated for, that it not be a separate set of rules. And that if one of the things that apply to public schools is they must take all children. And that, so, that can help that can do something about performance scores as well. And so we just have to figure out how to compare apples and apples, I think, in an honest way.
Other thoughts on this? Okay. Back here, yes, ma'am. Stripes, yeah.
I have a question for Mr. Wellison about the nature of bureaucracy, and it has to do with why you think that a government, that the employees at the lower end who are providing actual services do not have incentives that would Right. So I wonder about the difference between institutional incentives and individual incentives.
I'm sure there are cases we can point to. I've had experience with Verizon, and AT&T is worse. But the point for me is really very simple, and that is, what are the incentives of the institution? And if I don't like AT&T or Verizon, I can go somewhere else. But if I don't like the way the DMV is functioning, I can't unless I move to another state. And so it should be obvious, it seems to me, to everyone, that when government is a monopoly, and it is just not going to perform as well as organizations that have to compete for your service, for your trade. And I mean, it seems perfectly reasonable to me, and I can't imagine why it would be any different. There are things that have to be done by government, but on the other hand, when you are functioning in a competitive environment, you have incentives to perform well. And when you talk about, say, Verizon, for example, at the margins, the people at the top of Verizon are finding out through whether they are continuing to attract people or whether they are losing customers. They're finding out whether their service is good or not somewhere in the organization. And that's very important. That's not the same thing that happens in government. They don't find out. There isn't a mechanism for governments to find out whether people are satisfied with the DMV service, because there are so many reasons why they might move out of the state, and it's not likely to be because of the DMV service.
And if I could just follow up, elections don't work?
Oh, yes, elections work very well, but you know how many things are in play in an election. And the service by the DM... Look, let me say this, and that is, I've traveled around the world, as all of you have, and I am constantly amazed by how well the government here provides services. For example, just where I live, out in Colorado, you come to a bridge, and there's a sign that says, "May be slippery in winter." You don't have to be brilliant to understand that that's going to be true even without the sign, but someone in the government thought of putting up that sign. That's pretty good. Why did that happen? That happened in part because, in general, people appreciate that from their governments, and the governments that deliver it get reelected, and the governments that don't deliver it don't get reelected. But that is a very, very difficult standard to apply, because there are so many other things in play at the same time. In a business and in performance at the grassroots level, you are really only talking about one question, and that is, am I getting quality service for what I'm paying? And that means that a judgment can be made by the customer in a way that voters coming to an election can't make a judgment, because there are too many factors in play.
Over here. No question over here? Okay. Back there. Yeah.
Over the past few years, we've bailed out airlines, we've bailed out major banks, we've bailed out lots of different industries. And I guess my question is, if private sector does such a wonderful job, should the taxpayers be underwriting these bailouts anymore at huge expense of taxpayer money, which could potentially be used to actually create better services for government to do the function itself?
I guess for me.
Yeah, and if anyone else wants to comment, you're welcome to.
But I would just, I'm not arguing with the point, but we haven't bailed out any airlines, and we haven't bailed out any banks in a long, long time. The airlines have gone into bankruptcy, and they've come out of bankruptcy, but the government has not subsidized them in any way, at least that I'm aware of, except maybe through through building airports, but maybe
Liability protections, too. Pension funds?
somewhat. And as to the banks, the last real bank bailout of any significance was in 1984 with Continental Illinois, but the point in general is correct. What should the government be subsidizing? But when companies go into bankruptcy or require subsidization, it is frequently because they haven't performed well. And as a result of that lack of performance, they've been abandoned by their customers. And sometimes companies are necessary. If Boeing, for example, were to go out of business, it would probably have to be subsidized to come back in some way, because we only have now two major airplane builders in this country, and Boeing is one of them, and there's a national security issue associated with that. But other than that, I'm really not sure that government is doing that much to subsidize the private sector.
Over here, sir.
I'm glad you're. Sorry. I'm Tom Hilbink. I work at the Open Society Institute, and last year we created the Transparency and Integrity Fund to support a lot of advocacy and other work around some of these very serious problems that we're talking about. One of those things in developing the fund was I went around the country and talked to people about advocates about their efforts to bring greater accountability to government functions, to renew integrity in institutions like the Department of Justice and the science agencies, the Consumer Protection Safety Administration, and others. And what one advocate after another said to me was, until we take care of the ideology that privatization is inherently better and more efficient, and I appreciate, Mr. Wallison, that you really emphasized, in theory, it's more efficient, because in theory, human, nature was created by an intelligent designer, and in theory, the sun revolves around the earth. And I think more and more people young economists are challenging the assumptions that go into and drive that ideology, and showing that that's not always the case. So I want to encourage people, if you're concerned about pushing back and challenging, and not saying that privatization is always bad, because of course it isn't, and that's one thing I really appreciate about some of the panelists. But if you're interested in pushing back on that, if you have projects that are pushing back on that, I encourage you to talk to me and talk to my colleagues at the Open Society Institute, who are encouraging a greater debate in this country about that dominant assumption about privatization.
Yes, sir. Right here. Peter Conti Brown.
Thank you very much. I had a question, shifting gears actually a little bit from the domestic front, about the legal status of defense contractors, not in war zones necessarily, but in hotspots. And I'm thinking particularly of something that was in the paper that came totally as news to me a week ago, which is a few defense contractors held hostage in Colombia. And it was reflecting on how that would be different if those defense contractors were doing the same kinds of things that our uniformed military might do, if instead of being defense contractors, they'd been uniformed military. And so what are some of the legal implications for diplomacy under international law and treaties for two American citizens doing identical work, one of whom is a contractor and a private citizen, the other one is a uniformed member of the military, who are taken hostage? And why is it just that I'm not reading the right papers, that I didn't know about this, that we've got people who are held hostage by, in Colombia, or defense contractors? The security around defense contractors, I think, is a perplexing question.
And this isn't this context, but if you're in an international armed conflict and a contractor is doing something that might qualify as engaging in hostilities, and some of the work that some of the security contractors have done would arguably meet that definition, the contractor would not be eligible for POW status. There's a strong case that could be made that they would not be. Normally, civilians accompanying the force are, but in that setting, they wouldn't be. in international humanitarian law, when you're dealing with any kind of armed conflict, the key is whether the contractor is taking direct part in hostilities. Now, the U.S. military draws a distinction between offensive and defensive actions, but from the point of view of many international law scholars and from the point of view of the Geneva Conventions, that is not a distinction that makes sense. So if the contractor is engaged in hostilities, and we can have a debate about what that line is, then they don't get some of the same protections that they would get as civilians. Now, the Colombia example would probably not rise to the level of an armed conflict, so then we're in a different terrain from the point of view of international law.
Yeah, Scott.
I just add on to, and I think that analysis is exactly right. I would just add on to this that that we also have the bilateral agreements, which can play some important role here, and particularly the status of forces agreements, which are being negotiated. And in this area, we're seeing a shift in paradigm by the Bush administration from the historical role that status of forces agreements have taken to a much more assertive, aggressive posture of incorporating these contractors into the area of coverage. With the SOFA agreements, we've seen this being proposed. I mean, first of all, this happened in Coalition Provisional Authority Order number 17, effectively, in Iraq, brought in that notion. We're seeing it being proposed now in the SOFA agreement in Iraq, another one in Afghanistan, and I've heard it's been raised with a number of other nations around the world. So we've got this bilateral agreement, which is going to give them a range at least of limited immunity, and that creates issues for the United States, because if the accountability mechanisms of the host nation don't apply, the U.S. has to be able to reach in and deal with it, and that's a question more than anything else for the Defense Department and Department of Justice.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Two things. I think this is an example of a situation where the law needs to catch up with reality very often. The other thing I'd say is when you try to define what is an offensive function in a forward deployed area, it can get really murky. For example, providing logistics support to a fighter jet so that it can go back into the air in a hangar someplace. Is that an offensive function? Some people would argue, yes, it is. And so, you know, what constitutes an offensive activity is probably pretty broad given technology.
Yes, ma'am. Peter.
Two questions, I guess two related questions are unrelated. First, for Carrie, you mentioned that we should compare apples and apples in terms of looking at privatization versus public services. I'm wondering, to the extent that there are political issues in terms of pushing reform of public measures, does privatization serve a useful function in terms of setting up a competing model to force the discussion as to what kinds of common metrics should be used in evaluation? That's one question for you. And just a broader question to the panel is there a distinction between privatization of public services as opposed to public assets? And I'm thinking here of toll roads that are especially happening around the country.
In answer to your first question, I'm guessing in theory, but in theory, lots of things happen. That it could set up a debate about what the common metrics are, but in reality, I'll take an example of prisons, and you can look at the per diem cost of a private prison versus a public prison in a particular state, and say, yep, cheaper to privatize, when in fact, one of the reasons it's cheaper to privatize is that inmates who need intensive medical care are sent into the public system. And so that's the orange you're looking at in the public system while you're looking at the apple of costs without those medical costs included. And yeah, we certainly try to raise that issue, and let's at least, do the math. I think the political reality is it often doesn't lead to that kind of examination.
Public assets?
Yeah, or just a related point, which is that privatization can reduce public oversight and transparency, and it sort of creates a kind of double delegation problem. Not only are you delegating to an agency, but then that agency is delegating to a contractor. But there are spaces of enhanced visibility and transparency, uneven ones. And one place is potentially through the courts, because arguably the state action doctrine, which can shield governmental actors, could be read in such a way as not to apply to contractors. And in the foreign affairs area, we have a number of very interesting cases percolating their way through the courts, where the question is whether contractors should get the benefit of the political question doctrine or whether they should get the immunities that governmental actors would get in litigation. And surprisingly, courts are rejecting that. The Fifth Circuit just last week rejected a political question judgment from the court below. The 11th Circuit, the District Court in D.C. have rejected political question arguments and blanket immunity arguments by the contractors. And so these cases are proceeding. There's fact-finding that's going on, which is generating information, and it would be very interesting to see. But the courts are potentially a space where, through civil litigation and tort litigation, contractors might be held more accountable than governmental actors when you have privatization.
If I could just add one point, I think that there are a number of interesting distinctions between the privatization of services and of assets, but there is one point of commonality that I wanted to focus on a little bit too, because it seems to me that you are absolutely faced with the most incredibly intricate question, which is defining what is the value of a particular asset or service, right? And this is integral and an antecedent question to how you write up the contract, what you actually require, what the operator of the toll road is going to have to provide, for example. And I've seen both the U.S. and also countries around the world struggle with this, and they have not all done a great job. I think Mexico, oddly enough, is a place where toll road privatization has proceeded with a sense of a political understanding that alternative roads have to be available to people who just can't pay the tolls. And the arrangements worked out with the toll road operators include subsidies for the maintenance of the non-toll roads as well. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, you've got the same question you have in cases like Ohio versus Department of Interior, where the problem is figuring out how much is this piece of land worth? And is it worth something? It sort of brings up the questions you brought up earlier about how we understand the relationship between psychology and economics. If someone has never visited a particular national park, but likes the idea of having the park there because people they know can visit it, how do we count that, right? And ultimately, the answer to that question then determines the economics of whether it's worthwhile to privatize or not. Yes, sir.
So my question is for Mr. Wallace, and I know you haven't got many.
I didn't expect many.
Yeah, I guess you know.
And if you want to go into the witness protection program, just let me know, by the way. I know it's not your style, but I just want to put the offer out.
I'm going to get out of here before they all stand up.
So you've talked a lot about the free market and systems of perfect competition, rational actors, and as the gentleman over here pointed out, a lot of behavioral economists have taken issue with those things. But even assuming that's true, what I see in the government, especially in this administration, is a lot of no-bid contracting. And I don't see how that's any different from your government monopoly that you denigrate. And in particular, Blackwater. We pay Blackwater significantly more than we pay our normal uniformed soldiers. So I don't understand how that's saving the taxpayer any money.
I don't understand it either.
Okay.
No-bid contracts are very difficult to arrange under the contracting laws that Congress has put in place, but there are exceptions for them. And if you fit within the exceptions, you can do it. But I'm not saying that those things necessarily save money. Normally, the exceptions are put into place because the price under the circumstances is not the key factor that people are concerned about. Acting quickly may be one of them. But why Blackwater would have gotten its contract, I have no idea.
Okay. Yes, sir, back there. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So I appreciated your focus, Ms. Corpy, at the beginning on service provision. How are we going to get the best services? And I think that actually some of your examples of how public provision of those services survive some of Mr. Wallace's objections. He mentioned computer systems that the FBI has failed on recently, but if he and I are thinking of the same example, actually those were through a private contractor. I wanted to broaden the question beyond, though, thinking just about efficiency and who does what better in terms of service provision, and invite the panel to think about other public values that are at stake. Efficiency is a public value, but there are competing public values. Equality. Rights might be more important than dollars at times. And even beyond some sort of notion of core government services that need to remain in the public sector, is there still room for an argument which says that it's important to have public officials or public employees collecting taxes? Because that's just something that our government should do. I don't know exactly how to put a fine philosophical point on it, but I think you see the distinction I'm making between efficiency arguments and something broader, more related to the public sphere. So first, is there still room for those? Is there still room for those kinds of arguments? And second, actually bringing it to today's political situation, or tomorrow's political situation, do you see that those kinds of arguments shifting with potential shift in administration in November?
I would certainly hope so. I think that what our members have experienced for decades now is the fact that government has become a joke. And that's not good for them, it's not good for their morale, but it's also not good for democracy, as far as I can tell. When Dan Abrams says, the things people hate about Washington, and I listen to it and I enjoy it, and then I think, ooh, it's kind of like a guilty pleasure, Or David Letterman makes jokes, and it's become part of the culture, and I think that's a problem for all of us. And I could go on about I don't think it's an accident by any means, and I hope that all of us who care about democracy will take that very seriously and work to change that.
Before we thank the panelists, I'd like to make 2 points. One, Senator Leahy, who will speak right after this panel at 1:15, is in a very punctual state of mind. So head to the ballroom as soon as you can after this panel. And second, I'd like to thank you all for being such an engaged and active audience. And with that, thank you to our panelists.
Nice to meet you, Carrie.